Hello YouTube, this is Daniel Freeman with my first tutorial in my Blender Basics series. The purpose of this series is just to get people who have no experience with Blender to learn the basics of the program. The first thing you'll need is something called Blender, which is a free 3D program. You can find it at blender.org. And if you do not have a photo editor such as Photoshop, there is a really great one called GIMP, which can be found at gimp.org. So once you have a photo editor and Blender, we can get started, and they're both free. What we're going to be learning in this lesson is going to be just some basic screen navigation, such as rotation, scrolling, and zooming on the screen, selection, and the Blender cursor, as well as basic object manipulation, such as rotating the object, scaling it, and grabbing it to move it around Blender. When you have Blender, simply open up the program right here, and it'll bounce around a little bit for me. There you go. So when you start Blender, you're going to go have a splash screen right here. You can just click off of it, or if you want to open up an old project you've saved, you can find that under recent here. If you are using a trackpad, or if you don't have a number pad, there are a few settings that you're going to need to change. That will be under File, and right here you'll see User Preferences. Click on that and go to the Input tab. Under Mouse, you'll see Emulate 3-button mouse. Check this if you're using a trackpad to make it behave like a 3-button mouse within Blender. And if you do not have a numpad, which a numpad is simply a set of numbers separate from the letters on the keyboard. So for example, the numbers above the letters on a keyboard do not count as a numpad, so if that's all that you have in your computer, then check this. Once you've configured everything depending on what you're using the way you want it, then simply click Save User Settings. And that way, whenever you close Blender and open it again, it'll save those settings for you, so you don't have to change them each time. Now that we've done that, let's get started. I'm going to go ahead and turn on something called Screencast Keys right here, which will show you in the corner here what I'm pressing whenever I do press something on the keyboard. So you can see I just pressed N to make that menu disappear. Now the first thing I'm going to show you is zooming, and if you're using a 3-button mouse, it's very simple. Just rotate the mouse wheel. Just like that. And if you're using a trackpad, simply pinch or spread your fingers apart. And then I will show you rotating with the 3-button mouse. You click your mouse wheel and drag it to rotate the scene. If you are using a trackpad, simply make a scrolling motion. And the next thing is Dolly, which is just moving the screen up or down or left to right. And that's accomplished with a 3-button mouse by pressing Shift and the middle mouse wheel. And you can move it up or down or left or right, as you can see there. And unfortunately, when I press the mouse wheel, it's kind of hard to see in the corner. So I'll make a little sheet with different commands that you should memorize at the end of this lesson to help you out. But those are the basic commands. Oh, and the trackpad Dolly is just going to be Shift and scroll. There you go. Now, a lot of people, when they start out Blender, when they want to select something, they make the mistake of trying to left click, and then all that happens is this little thing moves around on the screen. The thing that's moving around on the screen is the 3D cursor, and that's just going to show where you add objects in your scene. So it's a point in 3D space, and if I add an object by pressing Shift and A, and going to Mesh here in that menu, then you can see it'll appear where this cursor is. So I'm going to go ahead and add a torus, for example. There you go. And you can see it's right there where the cursor is. So let me delete that quickly by pressing X. You can see in the corner there, X to delete. That's a very important command to remember. So that's basically the purpose of the cursor. And in order to actually select things, you're just simply going to right-click them instead of left-clicking them. And in order to deselect everything in the scene, you want to press A, and you can also select everything if nothing else is selected by pressing A. So select everything, deselect everything with A. Very useful command. I'll show you now object manipulation. So in order to manipulate an object, it first has to be selected. So let's select this cube in the center here. And let's grab it first. That's going to be done by pressing G. And you can drag your mouse around, and when you're happy with it, simply left click. And if at any point in the change, I pressed Command Z on my Mac to put it back into the center. However, if you're using Windows, it's going to be Control Z. If you're not happy with the change that you've made and you haven't left clicked yet, then you can actually just right click to snap it back into place. Or if you aren't happy with it and you've already done it, just undo with the normal undo function. You can also move things in specific increments. You can see these squares here. These are actually, each square is one Blender increment. So if I press G and then 1, it will move it 1 square increment. And I can make that even more specific by taking the axes, which are these colored lines here. You can see the arrows indicate the direction of the axes. So this red arrow is indicating the x-axis, the green arrow is indicating the y-axis, and the blue the z. So it's simply follow the directions of the arrows to see. And you can also see in the corner here all the axes are labeled for you, which is very helpful. So if I want to be more specific, say I want to move this 1 unit down the y-axis, which you can see right here, green y-axis, I simply have to press G, Y, and then I can press 1 to indicate 1 unit, or 2 if I want to move it 2 units. Whoops. I pressed 1 and 2 and it made it move 12 units. That's why it disappeared off the screen. But if I want to move it 2 units, then G, Y, 2, etc., etc. And of course you can do the same for all the other axes. Now the next thing I'm going to show you is rotating, and that can also be done along the axes and in specific increments, or by dragging your mouse, just like that. And last but not least is scaling, which is just changing the size. To do that, you want to press S, drag your mouse, or put it along different increments. And it can do the same thing as the other ones as far as going along axes or going along increments. For example, say I want to stretch it to be twice its size along the z-axis. I'm going to put S for scale, Z for the z-axis, and you can see a blue line appearing now where the z-axis is, and 2 for 2. And now it's twice as big along the z-axis. So the things you're going to want to remember for this are G, R, and S. G for grab, R for rotate, S for scale. And then you're going to want to remember the functionality of the different axes. So simply look at the colored arrows, and that'll be a very good indicator. Okay, let's get started with making something. I have 3 different projects which you may have seen earlier. That is the cubeception, I call it that because it's a cube made out of cubes, and the atom looking thing, and then this weird creation which I don't really know what it is, but you can give it a name if you like. The first one I'm going to show you step by step how to make that, and the other 2 you can figure out on your own. The other 2 are really just projects to help you learn on your own, because I believe that's probably one of the best ways to learn. So once you're able to make those 2, you should be ready to move on to the next lesson, and you should have the basics of this lesson down. So let's get started. I'm going to delete this by pressing X and deleting. And then let me move the cursor back to the center. You can do that by pressing Shift plus S and going to cursor to center right here. Now I'm going to add a cube, and if you remember, the add menu is Shift A, and then you go to mesh to add an object, and we see cube in the menu. So click on that, and there's your cube. So we've added our first cube. Let's copy this cube to make another one. If you press Shift plus D, that will make another cube. And remember that you can right click to undo any move changes. So right click, and it'll snap back to where the original cube was, but it's still there, you just can't see it. So now let's move it. We want it to have a fairly even spacing between the cubeception. So let's move it a little bit along the x-axis first. If I grab it by the x-axis 2.5 units, and that's just 2.5 that I'm typing in now. That looks pretty good. Alright, so 2.5, so we're gonna move them 2.5 units, and we can actually duplicate the 2 of these, and we're not going to do that by pressing A, because if we press A and Shift D, it's going to duplicate everything, including the camera and the light here. So let's undo that. And we can actually select these 2 simply by clicking on one and then clicking Shift and then selecting one. And shift selecting is one way to select multiple objects without selecting everything in the scene like you do with A. And you might have guessed it already, we can duplicate these as well. So let's press Shift D, snap them back into place, and you might have already guessed, but we want them to grab them and move them upwards. So the upwards axis, as indicated by the blue arrow, is the Z axis. So let's G, Z, and if you remember, our value was 2.5. And now you can see there's a nice even spacing, same spacing here between these two cubes as between these, and so on. And that's exactly what we want. Now, all we have to do is just copy all 4 of these cubes. And I'm going to let you guess which axis you should go on, which it should be fairly obvious by now, but let's go ahead, duplicate these, grab it along the right axis, type in the value, and there you go. Let me know in the comments if this was too fast, too slow, complicated, simple for you, because I would like some constructive criticism, but I hope that this was helpful for you. I'm just going to show you a few more things that you can do in the view as a side note, and then I'll be gone. So the first thing I'm going to show you is the difference between orthogonal and perspective mode. Perspective is how you see things in real life. For example, if I were to get close to this cube, see how you can see the top here? If I were to zoom in, just like in real life, suddenly your perspective changes and you can't see the top anymore. Now I can actually see the bottom of the cube, but if I zoom out, I can see the top. So that's perspective mode, and you can see these little squares on the grid have their perimeter, the sides are different lengths. So that's also indicating perspective. You can see they look all squished down here, and then they look very wide up here. However, if I press 5, I go into what's called orthogonal, and now you can see the squares, all their sides have the same length on the grid. And if I zoom in, the top stays visible. It basically keeps the same angle that it had when you press 5, and everything looks the same size regardless of how far away it is. This is helpful for a variety of modeling purposes, but one of the other helpful things is that when you press front, side, and top view by pressing 1, 3, or 7, it gives you the exact front, side, and top view. For example, if I press 1, you can see that that's exactly to the side. 3, sorry, I had a little something in my throat there, exactly to the front, and 7 exactly to the top. And you can also use this to add background images, which I'll go over later. I hope this was helpful for you. This is Freeman of Freedance Studios signing out, and I'll be back with another lesson soon.